The guy who created Resident Evil literally failed his job interview. Shinji Mikami showed up at Capcom's reception party at the Osaka Hilton Hotel in the late 1980s. He takes the written test in the morning, interviews around the afternoon, and then waits for his name to be called. Out of 50 people, maybe a dozen gets called forward. Mikami was one of them, but he and the dozen were told that they could just go home because they didn't pass the test. However, 1 week later, Capcom called him back. Mix-up, they said. Except it wasn't a mix-up. Tokuro Fujiwara and Yoshiki Okamoto, two of Capcom's top developers, had gone to HR and fought for him personally behind closed doors. They insisted these guys had potential despite bombing the entrance exam. So, the office nicknamed Mikami and the other rescued planners the Zombie Group, because they had died and been brought back to life. When Mikami was in middle school, he saw this movie, and you might have heard of it. It's called Jaws. This was in 1975, years before he would create Resident Evil, but something about that film in particular stuck with him. The rhythm. The way that the movie breathed. You see, the mechanical shark that they built for the movie, the one that they nicknamed Bruce, was constantly breaking down. Salt water would corrode its mechanisms, the pressure systems would fail, and the shark would simply just sink to the bottom, and it would never come back up. Because Spielberg couldn't show the shark reliably, he was forced to build tension through absence. And I think this is one of the things that made the Jaws theme so legendary. We've all heard the Jaws theme song, we can recognize it. Those two alternating notes from John Williams became more terrifying than any animatronic ever could be. That score told you that something was coming, and the fear existed in the dread of what might be lurking beneath the water. And in modern gaming, video games use songs. They use scores to let you know when something is about to happen, when there's been a shift in something. And here's what Mikami understood when he watched Jaws. You cannot sustain max terror constantly. He said for good horror entertainment, you can't just have chase scenes. You've got to keep building stress, sure, but the real question is, how do you relieve it? And then he remembers the end of Jaws. The final confrontation where Police Chief Brody, desperate and cornered, shoves an oxygen tank into a shark's mouth and shoots it with a rifle. This becomes the core of Resident Evil's philosophy, at least in the beginning. Mikami didn't want fights to be something that players initiated themselves. He didn't want you to be hunting for monsters because it was fun. He didn't want you to feel powerful or in control. He wanted you, the player, to feel cornered so that if you didn't fight back, you would die. Every encounter needed to feel like you were fighting for your life. Throughout your time at the Spencer Mansion, the atmosphere feels calm, but it always holds this heavy layer of tension. And then panic and frenzy slams into you whenever a trap is sprung or a zombie attacks you. The game gives you limited ammunition, forcing you to either shoot the zombie, expending precious bullets, or you can try to run past it. You could even use your knife to kill it, but you'll be risking death. No matter what, every choice you make forces you to be cautious. This understanding of tension and release shows up through Resident Evil in ways that feel completely deliberate once you start to recognize the pattern. For example, there's this iconic section in the first game, the long corridor with windows on one side. By this point in the game, you've fought a few zombies, but nothing overwhelming. You're starting to understand how the game works. The hallway seems safe. You're not expecting anything. It's empty. You're probably thinking about which room to explore next, or if you're going the right way. And then, out of nowhere, dogs come crashing through the window. The shattering glass, the sudden appearance of these fast and aggressive enemies, and again, tank control, so aiming isn't exactly the easiest, but the realization that even spaces that feel safe or appear to be safe, in a way it feels like Resident Evil shattered your expectations or even broke some rules. And you gotta remember that this was something that happened decades ago. Today, this would be the equivalent of you being in a safe room or you being at a crafting table and getting attacked. Resident Evil was one of the first games to do it. It's one of the most memorable jump scares in gaming history. I'm pretty sure that people still talk about this moment today, decades later. Bad horror games will try to sustain max intensity constantly. Good horror games will understand rhythm, But great horror games make you feel that rhythm in your body and give you that cathartic violence after sustained fear. However, rhythm alone isn't going to make a horror game. You need mechanics that support the tension, systems that force players into impossible choices. Mikami understood the theory of fear from watching Jaws, but he needed a blueprint for how to actually build it into gameplay. And that blueprint came from a game that, at least at the time, nobody played. A commercial failure that tanked so hard it never even got an English release. The year was 1993. Fujiwara walks into the Osaka office and sits down with Mikami to pitch him an idea. You see, Fujiwara had some serious credibility at Capcom after directing Ghosts and Goblins, so when he told Mikami he wanted to make another horror game, it was worth listening to. The twist was that Fujiwara wanted this new project to use mechanics from Sweet Home, a 1989 Famicom game that had tanked commercially despite it being genuinely innovative. As you would have it, Mikami already knew Sweet Home inside and out. He had played it years before and he fell in love with how it approached horror on 8-bit hardware. Sweet Home was released on December 15, 1989 as a tie-in to a Japanese horror film directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. The game follows 5 filmmakers exploring the abandoned Mamiya mansion to restore frescoes while being hunted by Lady Mamiya's vengeful ghost. One of the most notable and recognizable things about Sweet Home was that it understood horror in games isn't always about showing scary things, it's about forcing players to make decisions that they're going to regret. Sound familiar? Well, the game implemented limited inventory. It forced you to choose between carrying healing items, key tools, or ammunition. Also, each character had unique abilities that nobody else could replicate. Kazuo had a lighter that could illuminate dark areas and burn obstacles, Akiko brought medical supplies to heal injuries, and Taro could lockpick doors. Losing any character permanently altered your ability to progress through certain areas. If Kazuo died, for an example, you couldn't burn wooden obstacles anymore, and if Taro died, certain locked doors became impassable, forcing you to find alternative routes. The game offered multiple endings depending on who survived, and every encounter was genuinely terrifying because you knew that death meant permanent loss of capabilities and that you'd have to start again. Sweet Home also had a soundtrack that shifted from brooding to pulse-pounding depending on context. It had environmental storytelling through scattered notes and diary entries which would reveal the tragic backstory of Lady Mamiya's descent into madness after her son died in a fire. And of course, there was the iconic loading screen, a door slowly creaking open before entering each room. I can go on and on about the similarities, but Sweet Home sold poorly, about 300,000 copies, respectable for a horror game but not blockbuster numbers. It never received an official English release. It was exclusively Japan. For years, it existed as this cult curiosity that horror game enthusiasts imported or played through fan translations, but Fujiwara knew that it had captured something special, and so when he pitched Mikami on building a spiritual successor to Sweet Home, Mikami threw himself on that project with enthusiasm. He genuinely loved what Sweet Home had accomplished and he wanted to expand on those foundations. The first month of development saw Mikami focusing on ghosts as a primary threat. He believed that supernatural entities would create the most frightening experience. The deeper that he dove into this ghost-focused concept, though, the more he questioned whether it would resonate beyond simply just the hardcore horror enthusiasts. The game delivered pure horror by his standards, creating the kind of relentless dread that genre fans craved, but looking at it from a business perspective, he realized he was building something that would appeal to a narrow audience while alienating everybody else. This might come as odd to you, but you gotta remember back then, decades ago, gaming wasn't really this big thing that it is now. It was a very niche hobby. And so back then, commercial failure was a real possibility. Capcom was and is a corporation first and foremost. They needed sales figures to justify continued investment. So Mikami returns to square one, searching for an approach that could balance genuine horror with broader accessibility. And so this is where he starts to draw inspiration from a movie that he saw back in junior high, George Romero's 1978 film, Dawn of the Dead. And this is what would start to transform Mikami's approach to making this game. Instead of making horror the primary pillar, he decides he's going to emphasize survival gameplay mechanics first, with horror elements serving to enhance tension and raise stakes. He was trying to make it so that players would play the game and feel like they had agency, to feel like their decisions matter, that they could survive through this experience with their skill and their strategy rather than simply enduring scripted scares. Zombies, therefore, become the obvious choice. Romero's Dawn of the Dead zombies moved slower and felt less threatening individually than Ghost did, making them more manageable, realistic, while still dangerous in groups. Other thing, the concept translated better across cultures, requiring less explanation than Japanese supernatural mythology. But Mikami would also pull additional inspiration from Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, specifically the scene where Leatherface appears without warning, kills a character, and drags his body away like cattle. That sudden shock of violence, the way that fear could strike without telegraphing, this influence would later manifest through enemies like the Hunter, or even some of the Tyrants, creatures that could appear unexpectedly and kill players instantly if they were not prepared. And yet, there was still a technical problem. Mikami originally envisioned Resident Evil using a first-person perspective, believing that this viewpoint would maximize immersion and terror. He wanted players to feel like they were physically inside of the Spencer mansion, seeing through the characters' eyes as zombies lurched toward them down corridors. The problem was that Capcom in the mid-1990s lacked the technical expertise to create the kind of fully three-dimensional first-person experience that Mikami wanted. The PlayStation's hardware limitations, combined with Capcom's inexperience with 3D development, meant that achieving the graphical quality Mikami wanted simply wasn't feasible within any reasonable time frame. As the team struggled to make progress on this technically ambitious approach, the entire project risked sliding into development hell. Mikami needed a solution, and he needed it fast, or Capcom might shelve the game altogether. And then somebody finds a French game that had already solved the problem by accident. Did you know that Mikami spent decades being embarrassed every time fans praised his fixed camera angles and tank controls? He literally tells them to stop calling it the real horror, because those compromises, those workarounds, and technical band-aids that shouldn't have worked, but they did, changed gaming forever. Okay, so 1992, MS-DOS era, a French developer named Frédéric Raynal is working at Infogrames, and he is obsessed with 3D technology. Like, everybody else is busy making 2D sprite games, and this guy's just tinkering with polygons in his spare time, trying to figure out what can they do. Then, Infogrames CEO Bruno Bonnell comes to him with this pitch. What if we made a game where you explore pitch black environments with limited lighting? And Raynal's like, say less. He combines his 3D experiments with his love of horror movies. We're talking about some Dario Argento, George Romero, a little bit of H.P. Lovecraft, Cthulhu mythos, and then he starts building a game called Alone in the Dark. And here is where things get interesting. So, Raynal builds this custom 3D engine that combines real-time polygonal character models with pre-rendered 2D, I'm thinking about Nier Automata, 2D backgrounds. It's a hybrid approach because the early 90s hardware just couldn't handle full 3D rendering. Alone in the Dark has you play as either private detective Edward Carnby or socialite Emily Hartwood exploring Derceto Manor, this creepy Louisiana mansion in 1920s where people have been dying under mysterious circumstances. But there is still a problem. Polygons and 2D backgrounds, they can't work together dynamically, at least back then. So what does Raynal and his team have to do? What starts as a technical limitation becomes the most revolutionary part of the game. They lock the camera in place. If the camera is locked in place, they can frame scenes cinematically. They can position cameras to show hints of monsters lurking just outside of your view, set up angles in blind spots, make you feel exposed and vulnerable at exact moments when an enemy attacks. Each room in the manor has multiple camera perspectives that shift automatically as you move through the space, creating this constant disorientation and anxiety of never quite knowing what's ahead. The devs weaponized the camera, turning it into its own kind of entity, an antagonist working against the player. As for the graphics, Reynal wanted to scan actual photographs of a 1920s mansion, but the 3D tools couldn't handle it, so they had to have the background sets hand-drawn by graphic artists instead. The low polygon character models moving across these painted environments just worked. Reviewers at the time said that the blocky, angular graphics actually enhanced the horror. It gave everything this grimy, nightmarish quality. And so circling back to Mikami trying to make Resident Evil, he sees Alone in the Dark and immediately recognizes it as the solution to actually finish the game. But it does come with a cost. Mikami was genuinely troubled by this. Fixed camera angles, tank controls, it's not what he wanted. The changed perspective affects immersion, making the player feel more detached from the experience. And so he's got to work through his feelings about abandoning his first-person vision for something that he considered fundamentally different from what horror games should be. But honestly, it just comes down to pragmatism, right? He can make the game using Alone in the Dark's approach, or he watches his project get shelved. And he does what any great husband does for his wife. He chooses compromise. I love my wife, by the way. But it is in that compromise Reynal concedes to that shapes everything about Resident Evil. Mikami has openly said that without Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would probably have been a first-person shooter. In fact, in a documentary interview, he said that in the end, many players told me that they thought the view is what made the game scarier. I was really embarrassed. I am still told to this day it was so good, to which I say that it was just a workaround. And he continues, as proof, in Resident Evil 4, the camera is over the shoulder. It was more immersive and playable. I wanted to take my revenge when I remade Resident Evil 4. But the gaming community largely disagrees. Fans still argue that the original approach created a unique form of dread that later entries couldn't recapture. What Mikami considered a technical compromise, we see as intentional genius that defines survival horror for an entire generation. Mikami would remain embarrassed, and even though every limitation became a feature, he still wishes it could have been done differently. However, Resident Evil was still nowhere close to being done yet, because Mikami didn't have a world. He needed a location that felt real enough to be believable, wrong enough to be unsettling, and detailed enough to sustain hours of exploration. But to find that place, Capcom's development team had to commit some crimes. You guys ever see those old Western-style buildings in Japan? The ones built during Japan's rush to modernize in the late 1800s, where European architecture got filtered through Japanese craftsmanship, so the buildings seem familiar at first, but the longer you look at it, the more your brain starts to notice that something feels slightly off. Well, Capcom's team definitely did. They noticed the same feeling while building what would eventually become Resident Evil 2. Instead of designing Raccoon City completely from imagination, they went looking for real places that already had that strange quality. Yasuyuki Matsunami, one of these CG modelers, admitted in a January 1998 Famitsu interview that they basically snuck into old Western-style buildings and took pictures. The cameraman actually ended up getting caught and scolded, which is pretty hilarious in retrospect because part of one of the most iconic horror settings in gaming history came from Capcom's employees wandering into old buildings with cameras like they were committing tiny architectural crimes for survival horror. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But here is something I didn't even know, and I played all of the canon games and watched all of the CGI movies, link in the description, but this proves that even though I'm a Resident Evil fan, I have a lot to learn before I become a Resident Evil air conditioner. Hideki Kamiya later explained that Resident Evil 2 was restarted. The team ended up changing the visual direction from concrete to wood and gathered new reference material from those old Western-style buildings in Kyoto, Osaka, and Nagoya. Jun Takeuchi would also go out of his way to mention that they found a very old Western-style building nearby, although nobody could exactly say where it was, because, again, illegal photography. That explains why RPD feels uncanny when you finally reach it. The building itself is a character in Resident Evil. The RPD is supposed to be an American police station, but it never feels like a normal police station. The rooms are too elegant, ceilings too high. The building has statues, puzzles, art displays, hidden mechanisms, but it gets even crazier from there because this wasn't where Resident Evil 2 started. Resident Evil 1.5, the cancelled version of the game. This was the initial and original vision for Resident Evil 2, and it had a much more modern police station with a layout that made more sense as an actual government building. That version also pulled from John Carpenter's Assault on Precinct 13, especially the image of people trapped inside of a police station while danger keeps pressing in from the outside. In fact, in the beginning of Resident Evil 1.5, if you pick Elza, somebody who was originally going to be in Resident Evil 2 but got replaced by Claire, you can see that she had shut herself in the RPD station. Then she goes around but ends up discovering that the entire station is filled with zombies. And you can see that vision presented in the final version of Resident Evil 2. Leon and Claire reach RPD after Raccoon City had already fallen apart, thinking that the station was going to be the safe place, but we all know that deep down there are secrets here that are about to be unearthed. Mikami thought that the realistic police station from Resident Evil 1.5 was boring. Honestly, he was right. Resident Evil had the Spencer Mansion. That place worked because it felt like a puzzle box, a madman's house. However, a normal police station could not carry that same pressure for a full sequel, so that's why the team pushed the RPD towards what it became. Actually, this is the thing that made RPD work. Capcom made it a former art museum, and that one decision gave the entire building permission to be weird in a way that made sense. But I'm willing to bet that a lot of you RE fans didn't even know this, that the real building that inspired RPD's exterior was Osaka City Central Public Hall, which sits about 20 minutes north of Capcom's headquarters along the Tosabori River. It was completed in 1918 with red bricks, a domed roof, polished floors, tall pillars, and the same kind of civic grandeur that you feel when you're playing Leon or Claire and you step into RPD's main hall. Except there's more to this, because by 1998, Umbrella's money was already in the veins of Raccoon City. The company is tied to jobs, public projects, restored buildings and railroads, but they also donated a lot of money. You see, Chief Brian Irons, the very top of RPD and one of the pillars of Raccoon Society, was corrupted. He took bribes from Umbrella, worked closely with William Burke, and helped to cover up and suppress quite a bit of what the corporation was actually doing. And so you see where Capcom really did make the title earn its name here. The evil was resident. But their choice to make this the case gets even stranger when you learn that Umbrella was not always the center of Resident Evil, because Capcom originally had a very different monster in mind. Before Umbrella became the center of Resident Evil, the story was much simpler. Kenichi Iwao said that when he first saw Mikami's early draft, it felt closer to a rescue story with too much science fiction in it and no real virus theme yet. There were also character ideas that pushed the game closer to action than horror, and the vision for Resident Evil wasn't an action game. Geltzer, one of the early characters, was designed as this huge macho cyborg type who looked too powerful to be scared of anything. Iwao eventually removed him because a character like that makes the player feel too safe. If the person you control looks like they can beat zombies to death with their bare hands, well, there's just no fear. It was important that they shifted the final version of RE into something that made players feel trapped inside of something larger than themselves, hence Umbrella. Iwao helped build the idea of an artificial viral weapon developed by a multinational corporation, and he came up with the virus leak that turned the mansion incident into something more organized than a random fustercluck. Once Umbrella enters the story, Resident Evil gains a source that can keep propagating 3 decades later beyond the mansion. That is the creative turn that gives this series so much room to grow. Of course, the monsters still matter, and obviously the zombies became the face of the first game, but it is Umbrella that gives all of this a structure that can keep producing new disasters. Capcom built Resident Evil through strange influences, technical compromises, stolen reference photos, and a story rewrite that made the source of the nightmare feel organized.